You're a kid in school, right? And they're teaching you some bullshit like algebra or something like that. You're bored off your tits. So you look out the window. You're looking out the window and you're daydreaming. Now, the daydreaming is often fantasy. You work with a girl at work, or you work with a woman who you fancy. You have fantasies about you and her doing things, sexually, whatever. You're daydreaming. Okay? You're doing a boring, monotonous job somewhere, and you create a game out of it in your mind, or you go off into a fantasy world in order to take your mind off the monotony of the job. You're daydreaming. Now, what you're really doing is you're creating an augmented reality or a complementary reality that doesn't replace the reality that you're in, but supplements it in order to create a better experience with consciously processing it. This is considered one of the most obnoxious taboos to the control system. The control system does not want you daydreaming because they want you completely locked into this reality. And a huge part of your magical identity and your magical growth, as well as your spiritual growth, is the embracing of the concept of daydreaming and fantasy within your conscious and your cognitive awareness. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. Now, people might say, okay, well, if you're too caught up in fantasy, suppose like you're going to work, like when you're going to work in the morning and you create a kind of a role playing game about the same people on a train or the bus or things like that. It's a sign of not being mentally correct. No, you'll find that those people are the ones who won't have nervous breakdowns. The ones who will have a psychiatric episode are the ones who are completely wired into the system and do everything the system tells them until the system fails them. And they have so much belief in the system and the almost the divine integrity of the system that when the system fails, they fail. Where if you know that there's an element of the system is complete bullshit and you can process yourself outside of that in terms of fantasy, daydreaming, whatever, imaginary imagination, you are helping to take away your addiction or your codependency on the system. It's a very common thing that people do in situations like prison. People who generally survive prison are ones who create a fantasy in their mind that they're not there. They're somewhere else. This is very close to things like astral dreaming or projection dreaming. It's get literally if we were taught this in school, so many people's lives would be much healthier. There's absolutely nothing wrong in your mind having a fantasy existence. Now, there was a fantastic TV show in Britain, in the BBC, I think it was. It might have been, I think it was BBC, in the early 80s called The Rise and Fall of Reginald Perrin, or The Fall and Rise of Reginald Perrin. And it was about a minor executive at an ice cream company in London. And the only way he could actually deal with the absurdity of his employment, his job, his work, the people around him, was to go into a fantasy world. Eventually, this fantasy world became so necessary for his survival as he was waking up that he actually became another person called Martin. He had a symbolic Dionysian sacrifice where he went into the sea and came out a different person. The person he came out after he had symbolically sacrificed himself did everything the reverse of what he was supposed to do as the respectable English manager in London in the early 80s. And his life immensely improved as the life of people all around him because he had taken fantasy and he had dreamed the new reality into existence. This is a very it's terrifying to think that so many parents and school teachers particularly discourage children from active imaginative dreaming, because this is a pathological modifier. As things start to go wrong in their lives, if they have a sort of a healthy dissociative sense of fantasy where they jump into something else to, not to distract, it's literally to compensate for what's going on. It can actually help them avoid things like addictions, nervous breakdowns, and it is a magical thing, but it's also has a power, because I can tell you for a fact, if you do it, it actually starts to come true. You will actually start to slowly, I wouldn't say hack the matrix, but almost like put dents in it. Like when you push a piece of bread is just come from the on the oven, and you push your finger in to the crust, and then it comes back out, but not fully. It's like that. It's like that. You're toying with with reality, and therefore you're giving yourself. So, for instance, you are. Remember, they even wrote a book about it called Walt the Font. If it comes into real life, it's bad news, but once it remains in the fantasy world, it's beautiful actually. So to deal with the drudgery of an existence is to actually go off in your mind and live somewhere else when you have the opportunity to do it. And I've always done this. I've always, I can remember like I had one job where I had to walk home in the evening when I was fairly young, through a park, and the park I in my mind had basically turned into a kind of a Middle Earth type of environment. I imagined there were dryads living up on the hills there, and there were orcs and other kind of beings that lived there, purely. And then as I'd walk home and even to amuse myself or going there in the morning, I would think about, like, if there was a if they were to build a harbor by the lake, what would be the best place to build? And that's stupid, but guess what? It got me through the shittiest, fucking, most monotonous job. It developed your imagination because you're building neural pathways that are useful for other things. It does work. Things do. You can dream out loud. This is a. This is. And then we have things like there was that film Oh Lucky Man, which was, I think, called Billy Idol. Was it called Billy Idol? No, Billy something else. Billy Liar. And the guy had to basically deal with the monotony of a life of drudgery in the north of England. Had invented a fantasy life, but he had gone too far. He had not been able to detach it from his everyday life, and that's when it goes wrong. There was an also the there was the books, the Walter Mitty books are also about that. The thing is to not allow it to encroach upon reality. It can also be a fantastic psychological compensatory thing. Look at Lovecraft. His augmented world was to do with the fact that his own family, his own New England well-to-do Yankee family, had basically obliterated itself by the time from the time he was a baby till the time he was a teenager. And his fantasy world that he created of his mythos was a way of dealing with this without becoming See, it's much better let me tell you something. It's much better to do it that way than to become politically active. Do it through art and expression, but actively imagine this in your head. Now, I've been doing this instinctually since I was a kid. Instinctually, like I can remember, like when we lived on one side of Ballymun, and I went to a primary school there. Then we moved to the other side of Ballymun, and I remained in the primary school on the other postcode. I didn't move to the new school. So I'd have to walk through neighborhoods where I used to get the shit beat out of me every single day by kids because I wasn't from the neighborhood. Oh, look, it's him again. And they'd jump on you and give you a few punches. So I eventually was avoiding by taking huge detours through these factories and through these industrial estates around Ballymun. And they became in my mind almost like I was on a commando mission to Instead of the gangs oppressing me, it was a game where I was being stealthy and escaping them. And it did amazing. Rather than being beat up and going home and feeling sorry for yourself, I actually built up my self confidence that I was a clever at avoiding and being elusive of these gangs of little shits. And it just was amazing. I'd get every day I'd get home without getting a punch or a kick was like a triumph. And that's the beauty of this kind of active dreaming, this imagination sorcery. It's great, but don't let it encroach on your real life. Create it as an augmented, almost like an avatar type reality, and you will find that it will help you in all kinds of ways. And it can get you through very stressful times, difficult times, but its greatest power is to get you through monotony and drudgery. If you look at, say, James Joyce's novel Ulysses, that whole thing is about him creating an avatar of himself to compensate for his wife Molly's uh, strange relationship and intense sexuality, and as she was with other fellas, that through the avatar of Leopold Bloom, who created an avatar of a fantasy to compensate for the loss of his son Rudy, who died as a young child. Well, he generated the young Stephen in that book as the realization of his active imagination. And so it was at the end of that book, what people don't understand, well, the second last chapter, is that when Bloom and Stephen are having a piss at the end of his garden, it's like 4 o'clock in the morning, that's the two of them compensating for failures in their own lives brought about by a kind of a fantasy. Not failures, but problems in their own lives. And a beautiful, beautiful resolution takes place. And this is all comes out of fantasy. This is the beauty of that book, Ulysses, is that Bloom is such an outsider in society, not so much because he's Jewish, but more because of his wife and how she behaves and how the death of their son completely damaged him as people, and he knows that's never going to get better. The baby Rudy is not going to raise from the dead, uh, but he can create a new world of fantasy where Rudy can come back as as a relationship with a stranger he meets just by chance outside a brothel one night. The It was more healthy for Bloom to go into a world of active imagination than to get caught up in the trauma of the past and reliving it over and over again. It's sort of like a dissociation, but a healthy dissociation. It also gives you an ability to build up your charge. Like I said, when I was a kid, if rather than getting beat up and going home and feeling sorry for myself, because I made up this game that day where I was an escaped prisoner from a POW camp and they were the Nazis or whatever trying to find me. Every time I got home, and rather than it being a traumatic event, it was a triumph, a little victory. And those little victories were all got together to give me the moxie and the intuitive braveness to get out of the ghetto that I grew up in and pursue the life that I have and got for afterwards. And that was purely because of my active dreaming, my augmented reality imagination as a child. And to this day, although I don't have a monotonous job so much now, I really don't. Uh, so I'm lucky I'm kind of out of that system. But if I worked in a shop or if I worked in a factory, even my regular job is not like that because it's very sociable and I'm always talking to people and I like what I'm doing. But if it was a crap job, like if just a repetitive job, it will save your life, it will save your sanity, and it will save your relationship with other people because you'll have less resentments. You see, magic is not and sorcery is not just about. You see, this is one of the great tragedies of this modern age. Like you have the likes of Wicca and the rest of them saying it's all about spells and all this. It's the development of the self. It's the development of your own self and the charge that goes with it, the building of your charisma. And your charisma is not will not be built by things like, you know, cursing and hexing people, or feeling sorry for yourself, or wanting a revenge. It will it will happen when you divert those things away from your immediate consciousness focus, and then rather instead concentrate on things that are positive. And mark my words, if the only thing that you can make in your head positive is a fantasy, it will work. It will work because it diverts you from the pain and the trauma, the drudgery and the monotony of the moment. And that's what's beautiful about things like painting and sculpture and poetry. They're beautiful for that. Don't don't be afraid to dream out loud inside yourself.